You've probably heard people talking about what cards their opponent has in their hand, or even maybe during tournaments, the casters mentioning what the players might know about in hand, such as discovered cards or putting a card back in hand. Well, there's a little bit more to hand reading than just simply knowing a certain card is there. Let's talk about it. A lot of the pros, a lot of the really high level players know how to hand read extremely well. They might not always get it right, but they definitely have a lot more practice and they think about hand reading on multiple levels. So, the way that I kind of look at hand reading is to me, there's kind of three different levels. There's the first base level, where you don't really do much hand reading or care what is in your opponent's hand. The second is thinking about what key cards your opponent could have, such as a big removal or a very specific minion, and you kind of just think about that specific card. And the third level is looking at their hand as a whole combined with their actions. So the first level is pretty basic, and you can get by, you can win games without thinking about your opponent's hand. But I will say, I think this also depends a lot more on who you are facing against and your deck. Sometimes you don't really have to care what your opponent has in their hand. For example, in more aggressive decks where your goal is to get on the board and just push as much damage to their face throughout the game as you can, you might not necessarily need to think about what cards they have that often. Maybe sometimes in that second level of thinking about specific cards like removal, that can come into play. But again, maybe in a matchup, maybe you're playing a control deck and you're against an aggro deck. Maybe you've just completely cleared their board every single turn, and now it's to the point where the opponent is top decking. You don't have to care what's in their hand at that point. Unless there is a single out for them to win, maybe you can think about that, but you don't need to care what's in their hand at that point. So let's talk about the second level, thinking about very specific cards. This can definitely come in handy in a lot of cases, and I think it can move a lot of people from more of the beginner struggling into a more intermediate type of player. Thinking more often about what your opponent could have in their hand and what the key cards are that could turn the game in their favor is a huge skill. It's definitely one that you need to practice over time, so don't give yourself a hard time if you can't catch on to it as quickly as you think you should or that you want to. It's definitely a skill that takes a lot of practice, and there's a couple of things that can help you with learning this. The first thing is maybe looking at deck lists. Opening a tool such as HS Replay or Vicious Syndicate or the off curve data, you can actually look at the deck lists. Open those up. Look at a specific deck list for what your opponent might be playing. Even if it's not the exact list that your opponent has, oftentimes decks have kind of a base or skeleton type of set of cards. So, for example, if you are playing against a deck that has a lot of removal, you can look at that list and you kind of can figure out what the big key removal cards are. Brawl for Warrior, or currently in the meta, you have things like Whirlpool and Priest. These are big tools that the deck has that's going to clear your board. If you are a deck that wants to get on board, those are the key cards you want to look for. In other matchups, maybe you are playing a questline type deck, or a deck that relies on building up a very large charge minion in your hand. Both of those cases, you better be thinking about cards like Mutinous the Devourer, or even just a card that transforms something in your hand, or something that allows your opponent to see your hand and put something back in the deck. All of those are key cards that will impact the deck you are playing. And for hand reading purposes, you definitely should be thinking about those key cards. Now, if you get to this level and you notice that maybe over 2 or 3 turns, your opponent hasn't played those key cards, at that point, it's pretty safe to say that your opponent likely does not have that card. So at that point, you can make a decision on whether to push further in. For example, if you are a deck that wants to go wide on board and your opponent hasn't played removal, maybe that is a point where you just get even wider on board, play as many minions as possible to keep applying that pressure because you've read that your opponent does not have removal. This can get a little bit tricky. I think sometimes players often will look at only one turn and say, this was the optimal turn for that card to be played, and it was not played, so that card is not in hand. Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes you have to do a little bit further hand reading and say, they didn't play it here, maybe because even though it would be good, maybe they're being a little bit greedy. They want to wait one more turn and watch me fill the board, and then they'll use that removal. That is another way that you can actually deepen your hand reading skills. Think about, would they want to wait another turn, even though it seemed like a great turn for that removal or for a certain minion to come down or for a weapon to be played? Was that actually the best play? Are they waiting for you to go even further in? If you don't have a choice in the game, maybe you're at the top deck points and you just need to play your minions, you can't really afford to be thinking about that and holding back and hoping that they just don't have that. Sometimes that happens. But when you have options throughout your plays, those are the kind of things that I recommend thinking about for that second level of hand reading. Now, the third level of hand reading, and the one that you will see used a lot by pro players, is kind of a combination of all of this. They definitely know the key cards for their opponent's deck, and they make plays based on maybe whether they need to make an action before their opponent even has the opportunity to play that key card. For example, if the opponent's deck runs something like Mutinous or some sort of transform effect, then maybe the player decides, I can't afford to keep this charge minion in my hand, and they don't have a lot of other options for answering if I play it on board. It's more of a preemptive type of hand reading, looking at it from that perspective, but you definitely will see things like that happen in tournaments especially, or at high levels of play. Players will look at the key cards and what the opponent is doing. So for example, if a turn especially seems very odd, why did they make that play? Maybe playing a draw there or playing a big minion would have been the ideal play. Sometimes the pro players have to look at that and consider they actually might be setting up for something else. Sure, maybe on turn 7 a big minion can come down, but if they play 3 or 4 fell spells, maybe they're actually setting up for next turn and going for a turn 8 Jace. Those type of setups and looking multiple turns ahead are really where you can differentiate between current turn, single card hand reading, and gameplay hand reading. What is it that your opponent is telling you through their plays? Does it signal something about their hand or their game plan in general? Those are the skills that the best players use. Now, I definitely don't want this to come across as if you aren't at a certain level, then that makes you an absolute worst player. Because, again, we all start somewhere, and even the pros had to build their hand reading skills. And of course, as metas change, new cards come out, new decks are played, those hand reading skills are continuously being learned and readjusted. So don't feel too bad or hard on yourself if you're not getting it right away or you struggle with this. It is a very difficult thing in the game to get right every single time, and nobody gets it right every single time, even the pro players. So give yourself a little bit of grace when you're learning this, but I hope that you did take some value out of this and that you can take some of this knowledge and go into your next games thinking about the various levels of hand reading and situations where maybe hand reading is more important and maybe where it's less important. Let me know what types of hand reading skills you have learned or where you'd like to be in the comments below. But thank you so much for checking this video out. And for even more tips, tricks, and strategies, make sure you check out the playlist here.